I have often been asked questions about the history of prompting of quadrilles, square dances, and contras. If anyone is new to that term, prompting or calling, that's when somebody shouted brief reminders of what the next figure is in a set dance. I say shout because that was back before microphones. So whenever someone asked me about the history of prompting, I knew much of the background, mostly from 19th century dance manuals and ball cards, but I had never plunged deeply into the topic. Well, some of you know Tony Parks, the Contredanse and square dance caller. I first saw him calling in 1984, and I invited him to call dances at my 1985 and 86 Vintage Dance Weeks in Cincinnati. Last year, Tony was finishing his new book on square dance calling, and he asked me to fill in the details on the history of prompting set dances. I told him what I knew, but then realized that no one has ever made a thorough study of the topic, going back to the very beginning. So as I dug a little deeper to answer Tony's questions, I found that the more that I discovered, the more interesting it got. And it indeed turned out to be a fascinating subject. I've received feedback on my findings from most dance historians, and many provided me with further examples of it. Now, often acknowledgments of contributions by others are given at the end of a presentation, right? But today I'd like to give them first. I'd like to give grateful thanks to my colleagues for providing some of the information that I will cite in this talk and for their feedback on it. Special thanks goes to Paul Cooper, Mike Gilbert, Yves Chersey, Alice and Christine Rogers, Michael McKernan, Tony Parks, David Millstone, Phil Jameson, Nick Enga, Julian Teigbergen, and Tim Lamb. Okay, here's a quick overview of my talk. After centuries of set dances with figures, the prompting of set dances appeared contemporaneously with the popularity of the quadrille. Many written records confirm this. But why with the quadrille? Why not with the earlier set dances? To truly understand the emergence of prompting, one must first understand why it was necessary. And the key word here is necessary. When we analyze the dynamics of the quadrille, we quickly see that a prompter was indeed required for the average non-aristocratic dancer to be able to dance the quadrille from the outset, from the beginning of the quadrille, regardless of their country or culture. This talk will show that outside of the aristocracy or the dedicated hobbyist, if a quadrille was danced anywhere, it was by necessity prompted, with someone vocally calling out the figures for the benefit of the dancers. Now, to better understand the details and the examples that I will present today, we need to first look at some background information. So first, on the popularity of the quadrille. Did you know that quadrilles were the most prevalent dance in the 19th century? Within only a decade of their first introduction in the early 19th century until the very end of that century, more quadrilles were danced at a ball than any other dance, even waltzes. And when did it begin? Most historians agree that the quadrille became popular in 1816 in London with the first set of quadrilles. Now, to clarify, most of the traditions of that first set were French, including the preference for four-couple sets in a square, the Contredanses françaises, and the figures, and the names of the figures, and possibly the quadrille concept itself was French. But these earlier versions of a quadrille, both in France and in England, they didn't draw much international attention until the first set debuted in 1815 in London, then became the latest popular fashion in society ballrooms in 1816. Then its international acclaim spread from there. Now, this dynamic of popularization from a hub is quite similar to that of the polka from Bohemia, which didn't draw much attention for 14 years until it became a huge success in Paris with the renowned Polka Mania. Then its international vogue spread from there. So in the case of the quadrille, the world first saw it in London. Okay, second, it will be helpful to understand the distinction of the dedicated hobbyists that I mentioned a minute ago. Throughout time, there have always been dance lovers, a dedicated minority of the population who especially love to dance. They will put in the extra time and effort required to learn a challenging dance, as any hobbyist will do with their chosen specialization. So in studying social trends, we need to disambiguate dedicated hobbyists from the general populace. Today, the average person in most cultures does not engage in social dancing. In the 19th century, a significantly larger percentage of Americans and Western Europeans did, regularly participating in local balls and social dance gatherings in the 19th century. So my talk will focus on the dancing that the typical American and Western European did at that time. Thus, in order to understand the mainstream trends of an era, it's necessary to distinguish between the majority of the citizenry and a minority of dedicated hobbyists, or other specialized demographics, such as the aristocracy. Now, the study of mainstream trends, that happens to be the primary focus of my work. If you prefer to study the dances of the aristocracy or any other specialized demographic, okay, that is also a valid preference. Third, my talk will focus on the earliest era of prompting. That's the first half of the 19th century. That era is significant because before the middle of the century, dance manuals and other records were reporting customs that had been developing and spreading in an unorganized, natural manner, as needed. Then around 1850, American dance manuals began to instruct how to call set dances. So after that point, prompting was rather institutionalized. I commend to your attention the Rules of Calling, beginning on page 28 of Elias Howe's American Dancing Master, 1862. I'm putting a link to that in chat. Fourth, about the terminology. More recently, during the 20th century, some callers began to differentiate between calling and prompting, as meaning two different ways of calling out the figures. But descriptions in the 19th century use calling and prompting synonymously. More often, they use the word calling. So I will also use those two terms synonymously in the 19th century tradition, but without a preference for using the word calling, because in the early years, calling a set could also mean selecting which dance would be done, which could be confusing. So therefore, today, I will usually choose to use the word prompting because that term is more definitive. So prompting will refer to someone shouting brief reminders of what the next quadrille figure is, like chaîne de dame, lady's chain, instead of verbally telling the dancers exactly how to execute those figures. Then the next background detail is also to understand the terminology of the earlier era. Historical sources discussed ballroom dancing. Now, perhaps because of seeing royal balls and Cinderella movies or competition ballroom dance, many people today mistakenly believe that ballroom dancing meant upper class dancing back then. No, in the 19th century, ballroom simply meant a room that held balls, which could be elegant or a simple dance hall. In the 19th century, ballroom dancing was done by all social levels, formal or informal. Ball and ballroom were simply the terms that were used at the time for dance parties. The American Elias Howe's 1858 description of how to make arrangements for a ball most often mentioned these balls being in towns and villages, not cities. So when you hear the word ball in my talk, you can envision a simple community dance, as well as a more formal event. Okay, that was some of the background information that will be helpful to know. As you will see, I found an abundance of information on prompting. So I gave a lot of thought to organizing it. My talk today will have 4 chapters, so to speak. Chapter 1, understanding the nature of the dances. We don't just jump ahead into finding some example of someone calling a dance. We must first understand why a dance needed or didn't need to be prompted. The second section will be written descriptions of prompting in Europe, since that's where these dances and the practice of prompting began. Third will be prompting in America, which began 20 years later. And then a section on dance musicians. And you will soon see why musicians play such an important role in prompting. So part one, why the quadrille required prompting. Before the 19th century, there were primarily two kinds of set dances at balls. Now, a set dance means dancers paired by couples standing in a formation, like a long line of couples called a long ways set, or a square formation of four couples, as in the Baroque Cotillon and the later square dances. Well, neither long ways English country dances nor the Cotillon needed to be prompted by a caller. Why not? Well, country dances had an effective system where inactive couples waiting to dance would observe the dance several times before it reached them, so that they would know the figure by the time they danced it. Monkey see, monkey do. Do you know about that original tradition? If you're a contra dancer and you don't already know about this, you'll find it especially interesting. It won't take long to explain it. For the first 2 centuries of the English tradition of long ways country dancing, the procedure was for a member of the top couple, usually the lady, to choose which country dance would be done by everyone at the ball. That is what calling a dance originally meant back then. And she also had to tell the musicians which tune to play. Now, country dances were not all the same length, so the callers needed to be sure that the length of the dance matched their choice of the music. This is one of the reasons why average middle-class citizens purchase country dance compilations like these, published by John Playford, John Young, and others, to make sure that the figures and music match. Here are 3 original editions here that I have. Inside, you will see the descriptions of the figures with the music all there. Then, once the dance was chosen, the top couple either had pre-selected the other 2 couples of their set and had rehearsed the figure in advance before the ball, or else they quickly walked through the figure with those 2 couples right there at the ball. Here you can see the American dance master Saltator of Boston. He described the second tradition in his chapter on country dances. That was 1802. The top couple, who called the dance, quote, should require the tune be played over and then walk the figure over until they perfectly understood it before they began the dance. He's just referring to that top set of 2 or 3 couples walking through the dance. Thus, when the music began for the dance, only the top set of 3 couples danced, as everyone else below in line stood in this long ways line, waiting for the dance to progress down the line, 1 couple at a time, until it reached them. Thus, the inactive couples waiting to dance would observe the figure several times before it finally reached them, so they would know it by the time they danced it. Here is an 1807 illustration of those at the bottom of a long ways set waiting, while those at the top, that's at the left farthest from the viewer, are dancing. Well, how about the Cotillon? Well, it only had 1 short figure to memorize, usually only 18 seconds long. Here's an example of a Cotillon figure. Figura. And that was 16 measures long, 18 seconds. The set of changes of the Cotillon were always the same changes, already known by the dancers at a ball. That is also worth taking a minute to explain for those who don't know about the 18th century Cotillon. And yes, I know that name Cotillon is confusing to many because several later unrelated dances were also called Cotillon. Like, for example, a series of dance games or a 20th century debutante party. So here's how the original 18th century Cotillon went. It was a set of 4 couples in a square with a pattern of repeating figures involving what were called changes. So each cotillion had one short figure, and it also had a set of 5 to 12 changes, most typically 10 changes, that were already known and memorized by everyone at the ball. The progression was begin with the first change, which might be everyone circle left and circle to the right. Every cotillion in that community would begin that way. Then everyone dances the figure. Then dance the second change, which might be balance and turn partners, and then dance the same figure. And then dance the third change, which might be balance partners and allemande. And then the figure, then the fourth change, maybe all the ladies doing setting steps into the center, and on and on. So through 6 or maybe 10 changes. It will be clear if we can watch just that much of a cotillion in a video. We'll see my reconstruction of Saltator's 1802 Constitution Cotillion, which was at the very end of the cotillion era, beginning in the 18th century. This was danced at a Regency-era ball in Kirov, Russia, at the end of a week-long workshop where I taught Regency-era dances. You can see the footwork, noticing that everyone does their individual setting steps, and we'll see that alternation of changes and the 16-bar Constitution figure. Now, the first change is traditionally all circle around to the left and to the right. So to save time, I'm beginning partway through the changes with the balance and turn partners. And here's the figure. And here's the next change, balance and allemande. And here's the figure again. Next change, ladies balance to the center. So that figure that was always repeated between the changes was only 16 measures long. In chat, I'm putting a link to a scan of my copy of Saltator's dance manual, so you can see that most cotillion figures were that same 16-bar length, if you want to. Then how far back does the cotillion go? Well, if you're an English country dancer, you've already recognized that concept from 17th century Playford, like in Sellinger's Round. All circle left and right, which the later cotillions kept as the first change, and then do a 16-bar figure. Then all forward and back and do the same figure. Partners do siding and do the same figure. Partners do arming and do the same figure. But that first time that it was called a cotillion, and this is what led to the concept being continued into the 18th century, after it disappeared from Playford's books, it was French, from Raoul Fouillet's 1705 dance manual in Paris. Le Cotillon. I'm putting the link to that in chat, and also a link to a video of it being danced. It featured 6 changes and one 16-bar figure in between the changes. Then the first English cotillions arrived in London from Paris during the 1760s. And they became very popular in England. And of course, Americans were soon dancing cotillions because European fads and fashions quickly traveled to America. So how easy or difficult would it have been for the average dancer to memorize that 16-bar figure? Well, it was actually a little difficult for the less experienced dancers, but it was doable. Here is a 1792 illustration called Rehearsing a Cotillion from London. And you can see their perplexed expressions show that they were finding it to be challenging and confusing, Those paper lists of figures being held and pondered and lying on the floor show that the challenging task was the memorization. Now, you won't see those lists when we get to dancers rehearsing the quadrille. But as I said, that 116-bar figure of the cotillion could be memorized with a little effort, and I believe that it was usually memorized. So therefore, neither the long ways English country dance nor the cotillion needed to be prompted by a caller. Someone asked me, are you saying that country dances and cotillions were never prompted? No, we can't say that something was never done. We don't know that. In fact, comments made by the English musician and dancing master Francis Werner in 1785, and then again by his successor, Martin Platz, in 1791, they're intriguing. They both wrote that they offered to play for country dances and cotillions at a ball and, quote, direct the proper figures. Now, we can only speculate on what that directing of the proper figures entailed. Now, if you will indulge some historian rigor, I should address the topic of speculation. In general, so yes, prompting is one of the possible interpretations of the comments, but for my presentation today, I am only using direct evidence, not any circumstantial evidence. You all know why circumstantial evidence isn't allowed to convict someone in a court, in a trial. I'm also avoiding coming to any conclusions based on speculation, like, well, that early citation can possibly be interpreted as prompting. Nope. All of the examples in my talk today are direct evidence of prompting, clear descriptions of it. And there are many of these descriptions, so we don't have to resort to speculation. The evidence indicates that neither the long ways country dance nor the cotillion needed to be prompted by a caller, each for their own reason, whereas the quadrille did, as you will now see. So what is a quadrille? Someone, and we don't know for sure who, came up with a clever idea of gathering together 5 or 6 of those cotillion figures, but eliminating all of those changes, just the figures. Now, a cotillion was danced to one tune throughout the dance, but for a set of quadrilles, each figure had its own tune. So that added more interest as well. 5 or 6 new hit tunes in one dance. And they were the new hit tunes of the day back then. So you might be thinking, wait a minute, I'm confused. Was the quadrille French or English? Good question. That is actually debated. As I mentioned earlier, most of the traditions of the quadrille were French, including that preference for 4 couple sets in a square, the Contredanses françaises, and most of the figures that were used, and the French names of those figures that were used at first, and possibly the quadrille concept itself was French. But as I said, the earlier versions of a quadrille, both in France and England, didn't draw much international attention until the first set of quadrilles debuted in London in 1815, with authorship claimed by both James Payn and Edward Payn, both of them English dancing masters. So here is one of the most important questions of this talk. Could the first set of quadrilles be memorized, as the cotillion could? Well, the first set of quadrilles was not just a little harder to memorize than the previous cotillion. It was more than an order of magnitude harder, literally by the definition of order of magnitude. It was more than 10 times longer and harder. The first figure, Le Pantalon, was 32 bars long, already twice that of the average cotillion. The second figure, L'été, 24 bars. Third figure, La Poule, was 32 bars. La Traînée, 40 bars. La Passerelle was 32 bars. And the finale was 48 bars. That added up to 208 bars. That's 13 times longer than a 16-bar cotillion figure. And the average dancer was already at their limit of possible memorization with a single cotillion figure. As you saw, memorizing 208 bars of figures was a daunting challenge indeed. We have time to watch it, or at least the beginning of the first set. I like this video of the 6 figures. Now, half of the repeats were eliminated for this demonstration to save time. Now, if you think the dancer calling out the figures in French is for the benefit of the audience, nope. In London, the calling out of the figures in French for the benefit of the dancers was actually the correct convention of that period. You'll see. Now, as you watch, imagine every dancer at a ball having to memorize which part comes next if it weren't prompted. I'm also putting a link to the entire 6 figures in chat. That was only 2 out of 6 figures. Now, how long would it take for a dancer to learn and memorize the first set of quadrilles? Well, I recently reread The Etiquette of the Ballroom and Delineation of the Art of Dancing Quadrilles, written in Edinburgh in 1823. The author said that learning a quadrille takes 8 to 12 hours of instruction with a dancing master. But he also mentioned that learning to dance properly takes several years of lessons. So in reading that all together, those 8 to 12 hours are after one has already learned to dance and already knows the basic steps and figures. So 8 to 12 hours sounds about right to me from the classes that I've taught or taken. The author also mentioned Thursday evenings quadrille practice. That's plural. So practicing the quadrille was an ongoing time investment. The important question is, who would have had that much leisure time to devote to learning a dance for a ball? Who was able to afford a dancing master? The 1823 author answered those questions. His writing specifically focused on what he said was the first nobility of Europe and the noblemen's balls. The first set of quadrilles was famously premiered by the noblewoman Sarah Villiers, Countess of Jersey, the Marquis of Worcester, and fellow members of the aristocracy. The author wrote, quote, "Quadrilles, it is presumed, were invented for the higher circles, as the description of dancing more suitable for their education and taste and judgment, not to mention leisure time and money. The nobility also had the social motivation to invest that much time and money in learning the quadrille. Because as with the earlier Renaissance and Baroque courts, one's reputation and social standing depend on one's dancing skills when you're in the aristocracy. That is why they often began tutored dancing lessons in childhood. When the first set became the latest sensation in upper-class London society, those in the aristocracy were incentivized to learn it, which probably meant memorizing and practicing it for the sake of their reputation. So what percentage of the English population would be doing this? Well, like today's wealthy 1%, the aristocracy comprised a very small percentage of the population. The average ball goer in England belonged to one of the middle classes and attended balls to socialize with friends or as a social obligation. They would not have had the money or the time to invest in learning and memorizing a quadrille. But since they knew most of the figure elements that comprised the first set from their English country dances, they could get through the dance if it was called by somebody who knew the figures. So for the other 98% or so of the dancers who are not the wealthy leisure class, having the figures prompted was actually a necessity. Memorizing 208 bars of figures for the first set of quadrilles would have been an insurmountable task for the average middle-class ball goer. And next, the difficulty of memorizing quadrille figures was about to increase by another order of magnitude, because soon there were other quadrilles as well, many more. Edward Payne wrote 8 sets of quadrilles by the next year, 1817. Now that number doesn't seem too much. Well, look at his actual quadrille figures here. Take a moment to reflect on what it would have taken to memorize that many figures had the quadrilles not been prompted. Recall that many dancers had trouble memorizing just one figure in the Cotillon. I can't possibly memorize that many figures, and I have considerable expertise with quadrilles, far more than a dancer would have had in 1817. Then the famous Lancers quadrille was also created that year in 1817. Joseph Hart published almost 30 sets of quadrilles by the end of the 1820s, as James Payne, G.M.S. Chivers, Thomas Wilson, and others were also creating numerous new quadrilles every year. And as you'll see later in my talk, newspaper reports at the time confirmed that many different quadrilles were indeed done at a typical ball. And the ballgoers wouldn't know in advance which quadrilles would be done at a ball to prepare for. Therefore, the challenge was no longer memorizing 208 bars of the first set of quadrilles, but thousands of bars of figures. Who could do that? No one. Not I, not you, not even the leisure class aristocracy. It simply isn't possible. The solution was obviously to have someone vocally prompt the figures. And it was indeed a clear solution to anyone who was there. The concept of prompting is too obvious for it not to have been done. Put yourself in that situation. If you were there back then and you were the only person who had memorized all 208 measures of figures and your friends were clearly struggling with remembering what figure was next, you would have certainly have thought, I can just tell them what to do. Who would not have thought of that? Humans communicate. We converse. It's human nature to help others with what they need to know. Besides, memorizing thousands of bars of figures for the multiple sets of quadrilles at a ball was far beyond human capabilities. And all of the dancers on the floor would have needed to do that had quadrilles not been prompted. Now, if that line of reasoning was all we had to go on, that would be speculation, which I'm not doing today. No, we have plenty of written descriptions. The prompting was indeed the norm. What I'm doing here in part 1 of my talk is analyzing the 3 set dances of the time to truly understand from the structure of the dances why the quadrille needed to be prompted. Then parts 2 and 3 of my talk will show the written documentation of prompting. Hey, before that, let's take a look at the terminology of what these dances were called, because it might be confusing if not explained. Terminology was really messy in almost a humorous way. I think of it as the perfect mess of terms. Are you ready for this? It won't take long. The 17th century English country dance was adopted by the French Baroque courts, changing the name to the similar sounding Contredanses instead of country dance, instead of literally translating country dance, danse de paille. That term contredanse alludes to dancers standing opposite, contra, each other in a formation. Actually, the English country dancers here will find the deeper dive into this interesting. It will only take 1 minute, literally. English country dancers today know that their walking steps aren't what were done in Playford's time, but what was done. No one in England ever wrote down those steps, so they were almost lost in time. Fortunately, King Louis XIV sent his dancing master, André Laurent, to England to bring back more long ways country dances for them to dance in the Baroque courts. Here we see Laurent's drawings of the English country dance Christ Church bells, for which Laurent also described the footwork. It was constant doubles, which the French called pas de bourrée, ending with a little step jump when you got to place. 1 century later, that double and step jump, bump, 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 and jump, jump, evolved into a very similar chassé, jeté, assemblé. And that's the footwork that you saw in that video of the Constitution Cotillon. Then do you remember that illustration of those at the bottom of a long way set waiting for the dance to reach them? Laurent illustrated that back in Playford's time. With the important detail, can you see this? That those waiting to dance are standing close enough to each other to converse while waiting. That makes sense. Then when they are about to dance, they backed away from partners to dancing distance, which was farther apart. Okay, back to potentially confusing terminology. English speakers adapted the term contredanse from the French contredanse. Contredanse always referred to the long way set formation, as you probably know. And next, 4 couple sets in a square became popular in France in the 18th century, which also kept the term contredanse, because in a square, dancers are still opposed to each other in that formation. So to clarify the possible confusion back at the time, the French often, but not always, used contredanse anglaise, English country dance, when referring to the long way sets, and contredanse française to mean the squared sets. But the terminology gets even messier. French dancers created le Cotillon, the Cotillon in the 18th century with its system of changes, but the Cotillon was often called a contredanse in French, as were the single figures in a square without the Cotillon changes, same name. Then, shortly before the turn of the century, the term quadrille infrequently appeared, but randomly applied to any kind of squared formation dance, without a specific meaning yet. Perhaps the term was used for novelty at first, because quadrille was also a popular card game and a formation of 4 horses. I am linking in chat Paul Cooper's description of various early uses of the term quadrille. At about the same time, someone in either France or England, and yes, that's still debated, innovated this new concept of this contiguous set of 5 or 6 cotillion figures without the changes. Now, the English specifically called that a quadrille, while the French continued to use that term contredanse for this new dance, changing to quadrille, later in the 19th century. Therefore, in France, contredanse was a squared set, but it could mean either a single figure or a cotillion with changes or a set of quadrilles. Are you confused yet? Well, American terminology was even more haphazard. In the earliest years, the new term quadrille was sometimes applied to dances that were clearly cotillions. Then, once a multi-figure quadrille became popular, many Americans called quadrilles a cotillion. In fact, that was a standard for decades. You'll see that several times. Many scholars have been thrown off by that conflation of terms. With all of that, you can be understandably confused. So today, I'll be as clear as I can in distinguishing which dance I'm describing in my talk. So, okay, now is the best time to quickly address that ongoing debate of whether the multi-figure quadrille concept was a French or an English creation. An early English article in 1829 stated that the multi-figure quadrille was first introduced in Paris by J.B. Hullin on August 16, 1797. Then in Lowe's Ballroom Conductor and Assembly Guide, 1831, the Lowe brothers also believed in that 1797 origin of the quadrille in Paris. The undated Trois Quadrilles, Nouvelles Contredanses by J.B. and Hullin, Paris, is indeed estimated to be from about that time. These contain 23 figures, which certainly would have required prompting. Okay, this now brings us to part 2 of my talk today, early descriptions of European prompting. Having established that the quadrille required prompting at a public ball, do written records at that time confirm the quadrilles were prompted? Yes, there were dozens of written descriptions of the calling of quadrilles. The earliest, so far, being in France. There is a description in the Journal de Paris, October 18th, 1800, of a public ball at the Paphos dance hall on the Boulevard du Temple in Paris, where a caller was prompting the figures of a contredanse in a, quote, stentorian voice, which means loud, shouting, "La chaîne anglaise, le cul de chat." Those were 2 of the most common quadrille figures. Thus, only 3 years after the creation of the quadrille, prompting was reported in Paris. And then the 1813 French theatrical comedy, De la Houdière, written in 1812, has a scene where a contredanse is being prompted at a ball. And remember that contredanse was a squared set then, probably a quadrille. Quote, Act 2, when the curtain rises, we see the 2 doors of the ballroom fully opened. A contredanse is being finished. The orchestra of the ball is placed at the end of the second room and in front of the spectators. Scene 1, the leader of the orchestra calls several times in a loud voice, Le Camargo, Le Moulinet, en avant quatre, en cavalier soul, le cul de chat. The contredanse ends. Le Camargo might be the name of that set of figures. And then after that, those are all standard quadrille figures that the orchestra leader was calling out. Any social convention in a comedy would have already been well known to the audience. In this case, the convention of prompting in Paris. Now, the significance of the dates of these citations is that the prompting of figures was done in France before the first set of quadrilles premiered in London. So with apologies to Anglophiles, I believe the more solid evidence indicates that the quadrille was a French invention. And English speakers did call them the new and fashionable French quadrilles. Moving on. In England, the earliest documented evidence of the prompting of quadrilles comes very soon after the first set, on December 30th, 1817. Mr. Pratt, who is the conductor of a quadrille band in London, placed an ad in London's Morning Post stating that he directed the figures of the quadrilles, speaking in French. That was the exact same convention that was described in Paris 5 years earlier in 1812, prompting by the orchestra leader in French. And there would soon be other concordances from English sources that described the vocal directing of the figures in French by the leader of the musicians. For a quick side note here about these quadrille bands, those were actually small orchestras, usually 4 to 9 musicians who played both string and wind instruments. The tradition dates back to London's Cotillon bands of 1775 and possibly before that. The name of the quadrille bands that were played for the ball were usually mentioned in newspaper society column articles that described the ball, which sometimes also listed the instruments played. So we know that a typical 5-piece quadrille band was 2 violins, cello, flute, and harp. And additional instruments might be clarinet, cornet, French horn, and double bass. The French also had the same tradition of a small orchestra playing in a balcony box above the dancers, as you see here. And despite being named quadrille bands, these musical ensembles also played music for waltzes, reels, and country dances. Now, back to the topic of prompting quadrilles. G.M.S. Chivers was an important dance master in London, and he wrote one of the first dance manuals to describe the quadrille. He also mentioned the calling of figures in French in his The Dancer's Guide, London, 1821. Can you read the top 3 lines? Why were the figures in England called in French? Well, when the English imported the Contredanses françaises, figures, into their first set, it seems that they also imported the French custom of prompting along with it, with the French terms that went with that custom. As Chivers stated, the prompting of the quadrille figures was already the general custom in England by 1821. It's also notable that Chivers didn't find it necessary to explain to his readers that quadrilles were called in general. Like most dancing masters, Chivers wrote to inform. And throughout history, as a rule, if something was already well known, it need not be mentioned. Every dance historian is familiar with this tenet. Chivers' new information for his readers was that they needed to be acquainted with the French terms that were prompted. So this overall is true of all of the earliest references to prompting quadrilles. None of them informed the readers that quadrilles were prompted as if this was a new custom. All of them refer to prompting and passing as if the custom was already well known by all, and it was. In England, who was dancing these newly popular quadrilles? They were premiered by the aristocracy, but the middle classes have always been motivated by upward mobility. So they soon aspired to include high society's brand new quadrille in their assemblies as well. This would have taken about a year or so. And indeed, newspapers reported its popularity in 1817, the following year, as illustrators spread its vogue through engravings. The famous George Cruikshank drew 7 illustrations and caricatures of the quadrille in 1817, which were produced for the middle classes, as other illustrators drew their own versions of the quadrille that year. This one is called Le Moulinet, or Practicing Quadrille Dancing at Home for Fear of Accidents at the Ball, 1817. And we know with certainty that as middle-class dancers, because of those loose-fitting trousers called slops, which were originally the attire of sailors and the working class, and then adopted by the middle class, but never by the aristocracy. Next, we have an especially important description from that year. Historian Paul Cooper has a newspaper clipping, also from 1817, describing the dances that were done at the Berkeley Hunt Ball that year. It listed 12 different quadrille dances by name, with a list ending with etc., indicating that there were more than 12. That would have been an overwhelming number of figures for memorization. Here, once again, is what 8 quadrilles involve. Imagine the ball goers trying to memorize even more than this for a ball. It's just not possible. So this ball is significant in the researching of prompting for 2 reasons. One is this confirmation that there are now thousands of measures of quadrille figures at a ball, which is well beyond the reach of possible memorization. And secondly, Cooper noted that the Hunt Bowl sold tickets to the public, so anybody could attend, like professional tradespeople. That's further evidence that the middle classes were dancing many quadrilles by 1817, as we also saw in that 1817 quadrille dancing at home illustration. And as previously mentioned, middle-class dancers would have required the assistance of prompting when dancing quadrilles. Actually, anyone would have, once there were more than a dozen different quadrilles at a ball. Okay, take a look at this. Cruikshank's engraving, still in 1817, called Quadrilles, Practicing for Fear of Accidents. It's worth noting. Other scholars have pointed out that the musician is calling out the quadrille figure La Trenisse with a speech bubble, but I think the title of the illustration is also notable. The purpose of the practicing was specified, as it was in the previous illustration that we saw. It wasn't for the memorization of the figures, with the dancers holding lists of figures, as in that 1792 rehearsing a Cotillon illustration, but rather for fear of accidents in the execution of those figures. And those possible accidents were humorously illustrated in many accompanying engravings, like bumping into someone from behind in the dos a dos, or falling forward onto them in the vis-a-vis. This was probably the purpose of those Thursday evenings quadrille practice sessions, to prevent those possible accidents. This second chapter could go on for another half an hour, because there are so many descriptions of the prompting of quadrilles in England, France, and Scotland. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm currently finishing all of this up in a web page. I cite those other descriptions in detail on that page, and I'm putting the link in chat now. Then I will highlight just a few of them here. The most influential English dancing master at that time, Regency era, was Thomas Wilson. In 1824, first published in 1820, he mocked the affected French accent of a rival quadrille caller in his book, The Danciad, which was written in prose. Quote, "I heard this creature call the quadrille figures at his last grand ball." Note that this describes the calling of quadrille figures at a grand ball, not a class. And note that it was a dancing master who was calling the quadrille figures. Quadrilles were more often called by one of the musicians, but apparently not always. And once again, Wilson mentions calling casually in passing, as if calling was the well-known custom of the time. And it was. Wilson's barbed wit was aimed at this creature's fake French accent. If the rival was doing something that Wilson did not, namely prompting, Wilson would certainly have mocked that too. And later in his book, Wilson confirmed that quadrilles were called at balls. In a conversation between Belinda and Jemima, quote, "The practice is, which you've seen no doubt at many balls, to call the figures out. 'Tis done for those who cannot recollect." In fact, Belinda confessed that she had been dancing the first set for years without really knowing it. Quote, "The old first set, I must confess to you, I never yet thoroughly correctly knew." In 1821, Thomas Wilson, in his book, The Address, or an Essay on Deportment, he said that most persons who attended the balls did dance quadrilles, but, quote, "2/3 have never learned them." And now we know from multiple descriptions that it was prompting that made it possible for most people to dance quadrilles without having learned the figures. Now, Thomas Wilson was a complainer. He went through a long litany of complaints in the Danciad, but it's significant that he never objected to the practice of calling quadrilles. And here is why that's significant. We dance historians are quite familiar with the attitudes of a typical dancing master back then. We've read their books. They preferred that everyone take dance lessons, of course, since their career depended on it. So if the quadrille had started out being memorized through the tutelage of dancing masters, and then a few years later, someone innovated a new idea of prompting, thereby allowing everyone to dance quadrilles without memorizing them in dancing lessons, well, many dancing masters certainly would have decried it for the resulting loss of that income. But none of the Regency era dancing masters protested against the practice of prompting because it wasn't a new custom. The quadrille had always been prompted from even before it came to England. Okay, now you might be asking, are you saying that the quadrille was never memorized? No, I'm noting that it was customarily wasn't memorized. But there were a few exceptions. One is at dancing academies, where all the students would have worked hard to memorize the figures of one set of quadrilles. And I believe the quadrille was occasionally memorized when it was only one quadrille being done, like the first set at a small private ball. But among the hundreds of descriptions that we now have of prompting in the 19th century, neither I nor any other scholar that I know of has found a single description saying that quadrille figures needed to be memorized by the dancers at a public ball. Okay, just a few more early descriptions here. In J.S. Pollock's 1828 London Dance Manual, he said that quadrilles were, quote, frequently called, and they were called in French, as Chivers had noted. Calling was also done in Scotland. In 1830, Edinburgh, Dance manual by W. Smith was very clear, saying that it was, quote, the general practice for the master of ceremonies, the leading musician, or some other person authorized to do so to call the figures during the performance of the quadrilles. And he also said that they were called in French. Yes, in Scotland. The Lowe brothers also in Edinburgh said essentially the same thing, but rephrased it from being the general practice to, quote, as it is usual. And then importantly, many French sources from that time also described prompting there. Dance historian Mike Gillivert found a detailed 1829 French description of the exact timing that must be used when musicians prompted quadrilles. I translate that description on my webpage. And then he also found another description of the orchestra leader calling the figures of a quadrille in 1828. And he found 3 descriptions of the calling of quadrilles by either the orchestra leader or the first violin in 1834. Those were all in Paris. Dance historian Julien Tiberghien found another description of a French musician calling out quadrille figures earlier, 1824. Yves Cherset found 9 more descriptions of prompting in France from 1822 to 1837, all in the early years. So the prompting of quadrilles in France, which was recorded as early as 1800, continued through the successive decades. In fact, we have found more descriptions of prompting in France than in England. Now, as I mentioned earlier, some American square dance callers like to believe that the calling of quadrilles was an American invention, but no. Written evidence shows that the quadrille was prompted from the very beginning in France, then in England and Scotland before it traveled to America. Chivers, Pollock, Wilson, Smith, and Lowe said that the quadrille figures were, quote, generally called, the general custom, the practice which you've seen, no doubt, as it is the general practice, and as it is usual. But I think I know what a few of you might be thinking. If you are a historical dancer who has danced quadrilles at reenactment balls, you might be thinking, yes, they could have memorized the first set back then because I have. Well, yes, me too. I've memorized the first set over the past few decades and the Lancer's quadrille. But ask yourself if you are a dedicated hobbyist who has attended years of dance classes. So keep in mind that the average middle-class ballgoer back then had a career or a family to attend to, and most didn't take dancing lessons, as we have. They danced recreationally and socially. Recall that the London nobility, who possibly memorized the 208 figures of the first set, they not only put in the required 8 to 12 hours with a dancing master, but they also needed those weekly Thursday evenings quadrille practice sessions. The middle classes couldn't do that. And then the multiple sets of quadrilles done at a typical public ball were clearly beyond the possibility of memorization. And another ball the next week would have a different selection of multiple quadrilles. Even the most dedicated historical dancer today can't possibly memorize that many figures. I certainly can't, nobody can. So bottom line, it seems that the first set of quadrilles may have been created for the first nobility of Europe, who had the time and the money to possibly memorize such a long and difficult dance. And then, surprise, with the help of prompting, it caught on with the general public, the middle classes, who didn't have that leisure time or money for dancing masters. And then because of its wider popularity, the first set proliferated into dozens of sets of quadrilles. We could say that the quadrille was the dance that escaped the aristocracy. Okay, we are now on to part 3, prompting in the United States. We dance historians are often asked when the prompting of quadrilles began in America. The answer is clear. Since the quadrille was generally prompted and even required prompting, American prompting would have begun whenever the first quadrille was first danced in the United States, whenever and wherever that was. Probably not long after London's 1816 first set, because European fads and fashions quickly traveled to America. In fact, one was documented the following year. A September 20th, 1817 notice in New York's Evening Post announced that Mrs. W. West had recently arrived from the London Opera House to teach the latest new and fashionable dances, including the new French quadrilles. We know from written records that the quadrille was prompted in London in 1817. We know that, and she brought it from there. So we can naturally assume that it was prompted in New York as well. In her subsequent ad for her first public ball, Mrs. West used French terms, "un choix de quadrille," a choice of quadrilles. So perhaps she also kept the London custom of prompting in French. And that ad also confirmed that her ball featured multiple quadrilles, which would certainly require prompting. Then quadrille music with the calls was published in Philadelphia in 1818. That was clearly based on the first set of quadrilles. I'm putting a link to that in chat. Many more quadrilles were published in New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore in the 1820s, often conflating the terms cotillion and quadrille. That was common, but clearly quadrilles in their construction when you look at them. And we have written evidence of prompting very soon. In the August 15th, 1820 issue of the New England Palladium out of Boston, the dancing master, Mr. Turner, advertised that his classes employ a musician who understands the figures of the quadrilles, quote, and the modern manner of calling them out. And note the phrase modern manner with modern italicized, which is consistent with the understanding that set dances didn't need to be prompted before the introduction of the new quadrille. Written records of the early quadrille being prompted are also supported by logic, which I've been including throughout this talk. As you know, 19th century America did not have a nobility with the leisure time to devote to the memorization and practicing of these long quadrilles. So when the first set of quadrilles first traveled to the US around 1817, it would have arrived with the tradition of prompting. For the middle classes, dancing quadrilles and prompting were inseparable by necessity from the beginning. Okay, we can be certain that the quadrille was not brought over to America by just one person. The quadrille was immensely popular in England, France, and Scotland, and there are numerous traveling Americans like Mrs. West, plus immigrants and visitors from other countries traveling to any state in the US. And we know that American dance teachers included the European manuals, dance manuals, in their libraries and would have read those previously mentioned written descriptions of the quadrille, which mentioned prompting. Therefore, that 1817 quadrille in New York wasn't necessarily the first American quadrille. Maybe a bit earlier, we don't know. We know that one though. The dance was so popular in Europe that it was likely transplanted many times to different states by various individuals and dancing masters with connections to Europe. I envision like a willow tree scattering seeds downwind to the west, creating many saplings. Or think of communication in parallel instead of a linear series. Now, here's another possible way that the quadrille and its prompting may have reached the United States. Since the calling of quadrilles was the custom in France, dating back to at least 1800, the French may possibly have been the first to bring prompting to America, even before England's first set. New Orleans had been the capital of French Louisiana territories before the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. So French traditions were strong there. The French were so passionate about their preference for these four-couple Contredanses françaises that in 1804, a quote, fracas, that's a fight, broke out with the Americans in New Orleans, who preferred the Longway's Contredanses anglaises. So the resulting law mandated that 2 Contredanses françaises must be danced to every 1 Contredanse anglaise. And here I'm linking Maureen Needham Aldrich's paper on that, called The War of the Quadrilles. I'm putting that in chat. When it came to dancing the popular squared sets, this likely included the pre-existing French custom of prompting their contredanses françaises, especially because there were so many of these squared sets in an evening, twice as many as the long way sets by decree. That would have been too many to be memorized, thus requiring prompting. in New Orleans, 1804. So bottom line, when the quadrille was introduced into New York or Virginia or Ohio or Louisiana, it would have been transplanted from a different European source each time, one after another, always prompted. There's no reason to argue whether the first American prompters were from the early French or English or Scottish tradition, because the prompting of quadrilles was a universal custom, quote, as it is the general practice from the very beginning. Prompting belongs to the essential nature of the quadrille that requires it to be called, not to any single nationality. Here I am discussing the earliest transplanting of the quadrille from Europe to America. Then once it was established here, American callers would have added their own style and passed it amongst themselves, of course. In the multicultural mix of early America, influences in music and dance came from many diverse traditions. Now in my talk, I'm presenting the information in the order that it spread, from France, then to England, and from there to America. So now that we've reached Americans influencing other Americans, I want to say right away that we have 3 examples of African-American calling, and I will show you all 3 of those in about 5 minutes. And then if you like square dance patter calling, you can see a later 1888 example of square dance patter calling in Dakota territory, and that's in an appendix on my webpage version. Okay, back to the topic of the earliest prompting. Dance manuals are an important source of information about calling in Europe, but no American dancing master happened to be writing a dance manual in the earliest years of the quadrille. I don't know why not. Maybe American dance teachers were still relying on their European dance manuals. Then when American dance masters finally began to write dance manuals, it's no surprise that all of the earliest American dance manuals mention the prompting of quadrilles. The first of these, dance manuals by Henry Whale of Philadelphia, 1836, said the quadrilles were frequently called. The second American dance manual after Whale was the 1841 Ballroom Instructor, published by Hustis and Craft in New York. It reported the great popularity of quadrilles and was especially clear about prompting, but without mentioning French terms. This description not only further confirms that quadrilles were indeed prompted, but the bottom of each of those 2 paragraphs indicate that the callers might call their figures at their whim fancy. So we have evidence that spontaneous prompting existed pretty much from the beginning in this country. Fanny Kemble described improvised prompting even earlier in 1832, which I'll show you soon, where the figures, quote, depended entirely upon the direction of the leader and the band. And another 20 American dance manuals also described spontaneous prompting in the 19th century. This 1841 description also clarifies that many different quadrilles were done, with several examples given there. That would have required the memorization of thousands of measures of figures for a public ball had the quadrilles not been prompted, but they were. So far, we have about 50 written references to the quadrille being prompted in the first half of the 19th century. And as I mentioned earlier, I've not yet found a single reference to the contrary, that quadrille figures needed to be memorized by the dancers at the public ball. Let me know if you have. Okay, we have evidence that there were many balls in America in the early years of the quadrille. There were independence balls, election balls, hose company balls, stage man's balls, social assemblies, Thanksgiving and Christmas balls, hundreds of balls in every state. And the quadrille was the new darling of the ballroom then, with its custom of prompting. Therefore, prompting would have been well established across America in every state. Now, if something is already known, it need not be mentioned, right? Thus, the journals of foreign travelers through America only mention the prompting of dances when there was something distinctively notable about it, like being humorous or the cause of complaint. So when the Englishwoman Frances Trollope visited a ball in Cincinnati in 1829, she was surprised to hear the figures being called in English, Quote, they call their dances cotillons instead of quadrilles, and the figures are called from the orchestra in English, which has a very ludicrous effect on European ears. And her displeasure makes sense, since she would have known the London custom of the figures being called out in French. In 1832, the famous British actress Fanny Kemble toured through America. And when she attended a ball in New York, she noted that when a caller's prompting changed to improvisation, the dancers were at a loss. Quote, the whole being a complete confusion of purpose and execution. So apparently, in the very early years, American prompters still had yet to learn how to do effective improvised calling. It is an art that took some time to develop. Okay, what else was notable enough to deserve mention by foreign visitors? Well, out of these 50 mentions of prompting in the first half of the century, 3 European travelers found it notable that the prompting was done by a musician in an African-American band, as I mentioned earlier. I thank Phil Jameson for finding these. Even though African Americans comprised only 15% of the United States population in the 19th century, African American contributions to American music and dance have been significant throughout American history and continue to be to this day. If you saw my Zoom lecture on the dances of the ragtime era and jazz age, you heard me go into great detail about the important contributions of African American musicians and dancers. One of the descriptions of a black caller was quite early, 1819, in New Orleans, observed by the English-born architect Benjamin Latrobe. It's shown here, and I'm linking it in chat. As you can see, it was a complaint, with Latrobe thinking that the caller style was vile, but we don't care. He fortunately recorded the fact that an African-American was calling a dance while playing a fiddle. Now, since 1819 was a few years after prompting in England and 2 years after quadrilles were taught in New York and most likely prompted there, does that mean that the black caller learned the idea from the English tradition, maybe by way of the East Coast? Personally, I doubt if such an influence would travel that far that quickly. Back then, from 1817 New York to a black caller in New Orleans 2 years later. Far more probable was the French tradition of prompting the Contredanses françaises, described in 1800. As we saw, prompting was most likely the common practice during that 1804 New Orleans fracas, with so many Contredanses françaises being danced at a ball. Thus, that description of a dance being prompted in New Orleans 15 years later, in 1819, would be expected. I thank Phil Jameson for first suggesting to me last year in our many friendly email exchanges that French quadrilles were likely danced in New Orleans around 1800. And then when Yves Charset found a written description of French prompting in 1800, that completed the picture. Okay, here's the next example of African-American calling that Phil found. This was at an 1825 dance at a rural plantation in South Carolina, observed by the Duke of Saxe-Weimar Bernhard in his travels through North America. After mentioning that the musicians were Black, he wrote this. Now, once again, it makes no difference whether he praised or criticized this prompting or found it amusing, as you see here. It's important that we have this record of a Black musician prompting a dance. And if this page went by too quickly, I have it on my webpage. I hope you'll indulge my including all 3 of the descriptions of African-American calling that Jameson found. E.T. Coke, an English lieutenant, described a dance at a hotel in Lebanon Springs, New York in 1832. So there's an example of a Black caller in the North. And once again, we don't care if he liked the prompting or not. And you can take more time to read this on my webpage if you wish to. Next topic. I've been asked if women prompted quadrilles. It was rare in most places, but prompting by a lady of the orchestra may have been common in mid-century Philadelphia, as described by Charles Durang in his Fashionable Dancer's Casket, 1856. He once again called the quadrille a plain cotillion, as Americans tended to do then. Quote, as danced with us and as called out by the ladies of the various ballroom orchestras in our city. That's plural. So women prompters may have been customary in Philadelphia at that time. Next, you might find a note about Charles Durang to be interesting in his 1847 dance manual. We see that Durang was still referring to quadrilles as plain cotillions, as was the general use. He added so-called because he knew they were really quadrilles. But that's not what's really interesting here. Several things are. Durang mentioned that quadrilles were generally called by the leader of the orchestra. And once again, we see that the prompts were called spontaneously, quote, as they occurred to his whim and fancy. But Durang had a rather elitist, disapproving attitude on the custom. He preferred that everyone become accomplished dancers through the tutelage of a dancing master. And no one is surprised by that preference from a professional dancing master. And Durang said that once there were accomplished dancers in the ballroom, they would become annoyed by the calling that would be done for the amateurs at the ball, for whom prompting was, quote, a striking advantage or convenience. And he thought that the prompting diverted the orchestra leader's attention from the music, as it made him pay attention to the dancers. He also said that the quality of the dancing had deteriorated because, quote, any person could now dance them. But Charles Durang was the only American dancing master to give any pushback whatsoever to the practice of prompting in this first half century. And please let me know if you have found any other. The others describe prompting either as a positive attribute or neutrally, as matter of fact. So to conclude this section of my talk, the calling of quadrilles was ubiquitous in 19th century America from the beginning. Prompting was mentioned or specifically instructed in all of these 19th century dance manuals. Every significant dancing master described their prompting of quadrilles, with only one, Alan Dogworth, 1885, not commenting either way. He just didn't mention prompting. All the others did. The complete titles of these sources, by the way, can be found on the list of dance manuals in my collection, which I'm linking here in chat. Now, some American square dancers like to believe that the calling of quadrilles was an American invention. In the 1940s, some believe that calling was invented by American cowboys, and that was followed by other theories in later decades. No, descriptions of prompting in Europe predate all of those speculated American timelines by decades. And besides, those American creation myths are simply not possible. Why not? Okay, what was the required situation for an American to invent a new concept of prompting quadrilles? Well, if that was something new, then it was necessary that those many quadrilles at a dance must have previously been memorized before the innovation of prompting, right? But they weren't, because it's not humanly possible to memorize that many figures. End of discussion. If anyone doubts that, look at a list of multiple quadrille figures again. That many quadrilles at a ball required prompting from the beginning in France and England before quadrilles traveled to America. And then they required prompting at any public ball in America, equally by all demographics. Okay, in finishing this third section of my talk, I can also mention that I originally intended to discuss the prompting of contra-dances in America, when it began and why, but that would exceed my 90-minute time slot today. So instead, you can find that information on the webpage version of this talk as Appendix D. Are you still awake? My last chapter, so to speak, is on dance music. This is important because prompters were most often one of the musicians. Now, I haven't gone into detail about dance music so far because that would more than double the length of this talk. But if we want to know more about the prompters, we need to at least take a quick look at the musicians who played for American balls. Now, remember, the word ball simply meant a social dance gathering at any social level, from a simple community dance to a more formal one. There is a wealth of detailed information about the music for balls on surviving dance cards, ball programs, and invitations to balls. I have over 2,000 19th century American ball programs and invitations in my collection, from small towns to cities, mostly middle class, mostly small towns, going back to 1801. In addition to balls, these invitations and dance cards were also printed for hops, socials, soirees, levees, and cotillion parties. If we want to understand the mainstream trends in American social dance and music, these cards recorded a typical cross-section of American balls and dance parties, hops and socials. Fortunately for our research, dance cards and invitations often listed who provided the music for the dance. Looking at only the earliest 10% of these cards and invitations, most, 67%, gave the name of the band or the musicians. And by the 1850s, 83% listed the musicians. Sometimes the individual musicians and their instruments were named, but the majority, 77%, were bands. And more than 2/3 of those were specifically quadrille bands, sometimes called cotillion bands in this country, since Americans often called quadrilles cotillions at that time. Like Potter's Quadrille Band, Bradley's Cotillion Band, Pushy's Quadrille Band, Hall's Celebrated Quadrille Band of Boston, and Rice's Quadrille Band, 6 pieces. That number of musicians on that last one is about right. Now, today, the term band makes us think of brass bands. But no, quadrille bands were small orchestras, meaning a mixture of string and wind instruments. They were usually comprised of 4 to 9 musicians. The Quadrille Band Journal was a published collection of orchestrations for dancing from Boston. Here are the instruments. So does that instrumentation look familiar? Yes, it's essentially the same as the earlier English quadrille bands. When the quadrille was first transplanted to America, its original European tradition of small orchestras playing for balls came with it. When any new dance travels to another country, it's accompanied by its musical tradition. As I mentioned previously, the English call these quadrille bands, despite being small orchestras. The fact that American musicians adopted the same instrumentation and also used the same term quadrille band is further evidence that the Americans brought the musical convention from England. And as in London, surviving American ball cards confirm that quadrille bands also played music for waltzes, reels, and country dances. An early American example of calling of set dances is seen in this 1822 ad for Boston's First Cotillion Band, formed by Moses Mann with his 2 brothers. Again, keep in mind that Americans usually called quadrilles cotillions at that time. He advertised that they play and call a variety of new and fashionable French cotillions. At the same time, the 3 Mann brothers were also members of the larger Boston Brigade Band, shown here, indicating that playing and calling for balls was a specialization, not the entirety of their musicianship. This next illustration for a ball in Milford, New Hampshire, shows several quadrille sets of dancers. And on the left, you see some seated dancers. And on the right is the quadrille band in their box. It looks like there are maybe 4 or 5 musicians, as expected. If it were a large orchestra, the prompter wouldn't be heard. These bands were ubiquitous, found anywhere. Most American towns had musicians among their citizens who would gather into bands to play for balls, playing from printed orchestrations that were available from American publishers. I have 30 of these bound collections of dance music in my collection, published in the US in the 19th century. You can see that it's music for all of the dances, for violin, flute, clarinet, cornet, bugle, cello, etc., and piano. And I have over 4,000 pieces of printed 19th century sheet music in my collection here, specifically for these dances. So these quadrille bands would be comprised of educated musicians who could read sheet music. And that musical training was commonly found among America's middle class. There were sometimes several dance bands in a town. For instance, I have 8 mid-century ball cards from the small town of East Rush, New York, population of only about 1,000 then, and music for their balls was provided by 3 different quadrille bands, Bradley's, Rhinos, and Woodruff's, in the same time period. And many of these quadrille bands toured on the road. So if you would like to see old photos of quadrille bands, go to Google Images yourself and enter 19th century quadrille band. Or to see a more detailed examination, Michael McKernan has been closely studying early American dance musicians for the past 40 years. And he and I were working on this together 40 years ago. McKernan created pages of information about the American musicians who are most prominently mentioned in ball programs and newspaper articles in the early 19th century. I'm linking his pages in chat. Just click on any of those, what he calls stories. And to appreciate the depth of Michael's research, try to reach the bottom of his page on the ball prompter and musician Abraham Pushey. If you print that out, that web page, it's 267 printed pages long on that one web page, just on one American dance prompter and musician. He also has pages on Moses Mann of Boston, who I mentioned before, Alonzo Bond, Rufus Whitcomb, and 6 others. Okay, so what other kinds of dance music was there? Well, small orchestras like quadrille bands were by far the predominant tradition of music at early 19th century American dances, but there were also other options, like a single fiddler, as you would expect in the multicultural mix of early America. And as I mentioned, African-American musicians and composers also played a significant role in American music, like the famous Philadelphia composer Francis Johnson. In his recent Zoom lectures, David Millstone mentioned John Putnam in the late 19th century, 1850s to 70s, and Alva Belcher, also at that time. Fortunately, several books have been written on the important influences of African-American musicians, and I trust you're already aware of the significance of Black musicians in this country. In the early 19th century, Black dance musicians were especially noted when a dance had a solo fiddler. All 3 descriptions that Phil Jameson found were fiddlers. But there were also some African-American bands, including some in the North, like the Colored Cotillion Band of Canajoharie in New York State. Back to other instruments, music for balls was often played by a single piano, of course. And sometimes a full orchestra would play for a ball, sometimes all fitting into the balcony. This is in Boston, filling the balcony on the left side and on the right side. I don't know how a prompter would be heard there. Then German immigrants, who are a sizable portion of the American population, also factor into our dance music. And you can see the complete discussion of American dance music is indeed another long topic in itself. So to summarize, who were the prompters at an early 19th century ball? Usually one of the musicians. We know that. Who are the musicians? At the large majority of balls, soirees, hop, socials, and dance parties, they were bands. I have compiled a database of all 2,000 ball cards and invitations in my collection, and it lists the names of the musicians for each one. You can see that they are usually bands, mostly comprised of musicians in that town who could read the many published scores of dance music back then. Now, the blank panels here, those are the ones that didn't list who the musicians are. And those are probably in the same proportion of bands to non-bands, which are in a much lesser proportion, as you can see here, solo fiddlers, solo pianists, and the larger orchestras, which were rare. I have done very thorough research on who the musicians were at American dancers, and thus who the prompters were. And that finally brings me to the end of my talk. If it seemed long, it's actually the short version, edited down from a much longer draft. I apologize for not being able to make it even shorter. I tried, but every piece of the story fits into every other piece. So my overall disclaimer is that I'm still learning about these topics. And I wasn't there back then to know firsthand, so I can always be wrong. If you have any corrections or additions or any other suggestions, I welcome your feedback. You can contact me by email, which I'm putting in chat, or through the contact button on my homepage of richardpowers.com, one word, Richard Powers. And we have time left right now for questions or comments.